Alrighty, well, it's 1:02. I think we should go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to Offshore Wind Day. Thank you so much for joining us, and a huge thank you to our panel of guest speakers who are joining us today. Offshore Wind Day was conceived as a way to help us learn a little bit more about offshore wind and what it can provide for us, and give folks an opportunity to learn some more and also to take action. So thank you all so much for being here. So the agenda for today, I just wanted to run through it really quick before we get started. I'll give a brief overview of offshore wind before then introducing our speakers, who will have a moment to introduce themselves. We'll then translate into a moderated discussion and then open it up to Q&A at the end for the audience. So if you do have questions while you're listening, please feel free to pop those in the Q&A and our panelists will respond at the end. So what is offshore wind? Well, when we say offshore wind, we're referring to the offshore wind energy that's blowing off our coasts that can then be harnessed and turned into clean, renewable energy that's then transmitted to our shores. And we can do that by harnessing the power of the wind through wind turbines and then putting it into energy and putting that into electricity and transmitting that to our shores in the form of clean and renewable energy. And here in the US, we actually have a huge amount of offshore wind, and we found that there's enough to power our 2019 electricity usage almost twice over with offshore wind alone. And we also know that it's a really big proven resource on the international stage because Europe and Asia have been using it for decades. And since 1991, when the first offshore wind farm was erected in Denmark, we've seen over 5,500 turbines built, which is enough to power over 7.3 million homes. So knowing that and knowing the potential that we have here in the US, we know that we can go big on offshore wind and support our policymakers as they make big and bold commitments to getting our energy from renewable energy. So now I'd like to turn it over to some introductions. First up, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Nate Mayo, who is the Director of Public Affairs at Vineyard Wind. Nate, take it away.
Thanks a lot, Hannah. And thanks everybody. Just briefly, it's an exciting slate of panelists I'm joining here. Vineyard Wind, who many of you may have heard of, are an offshore wind development company with 2 lease areas south of the islands of Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, and are at the, we keep saying at the goal line, we're now at the 1-inch line, I imagine, with our final permitting for Vineyard Wind 1, which will be the nation's first large-scale offshore wind facility serving Massachusetts. Be a lot to talk about regarding that project and how it fits into the broader landscape. I'm happy to engage that in the Q&A. My work has been largely stakeholder related, as well as some of the state and local and regional permitting. In these projects, more so than most that governments interact with, the stakeholder engagement and stakeholder input segment is closely intertwined with everything that happens. And frankly, prior to lease areas being developed, being considered and developed over 10 years ago when that process started, it really, in this offshore wind 2.0 in the post-Cape Wind era, it really reorganized itself into very much a stakeholder and public interest-led process. And so we're continuing that. We're 11 years down the line here. Vineyard Wind had anticipated final permits 2 years ago, and were delayed at the federal level due to some cross currents and, of course, an interest in looking at the broader landscape. And in most recent news, as I'm sure we've all seen in the papers lately in the last couple of weeks and even in the last couple of days, there's been some really exciting news that fits into that pathway and brings us closer to completion of this first and critical project, which we hope will set the stage for future projects. We also have a project that has been awarded with the state of Connecticut, Park City Wind, which is in its earlier stages of permitting, but fits into our broader portfolio. So I will give it back to you, Hannah, after that brief piece, and I hope we can get into a more interesting dialogue further on.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Nate. I'd next like to introduce my colleague, Catherine Bowes, who is the Program Director of Offshore Wind Energy at the National Wildlife Federation. Thanks for joining us, Catherine.
Thank you, Hannah, and thanks for having me. As I said, I'm with National Wildlife Federation. We are a national organization based in DC, but with offices around the country. I work out of our Northeast office, where I lead our offshore wind energy program that we started about 10 years ago. now. And it is amazing how much has occurred over those last 10 years. And it is great to be with you all today, and Offshore Wind Day and Offshore Wind Week, with the big announcements from the president earlier, the Biden administration earlier in the week. But our work as a federation, we work with many partners, including our affiliates. We have one on the line here, Susanna from the Environmental League of Massachusetts. But we have been proud to work alongside Environment America and our many partners to build support for responsibly developed offshore wind. So we've been, we share the excitement, Hannah, that you brought to the beginning of the call about the incredible role that offshore wind power can play in meeting our climate and clean energy goals. We also know there's so much that needs to get done right to ensure that we protect and benefit both our ocean, coastal and marine wildlife and communities as we really go big and stand up this critical climate solution. So we've been working on both the market policies at the state level that are getting these contracts and commitments moving, and of course working at the federal level to ensure that the leasing and permitting is done responsibly with close attention to all those details. So it's a really exciting big moment. I know we're going to have time to dig into more of the details, but it's great to be with you today, and I appreciate you pulling this together, because it certainly is a big moment for folks to know what's happening and what's ahead and how y'all can engage.
Yeah, thanks so much. And next up, we're also joined today by Chris Oleth, who directs the Special Initiative on Offshore Wind with the University of Delaware. Chris, take it away.
Thanks, Hannah, and thanks for your interest and attending today, all these great attendees out there. It is Offshore Wind Day, but in many of our lives here on this call, that's kind of every day. And we're very fortunate to say that. I've been working in the industry now for about 15 years, starting with some of the earliest development projects. Nate was referring earlier to the Cape Wind projects and some of those first generation projects. So it's great to have the collective and historical knowledge I think we're assembling today, and hopefully we can share some good information with you. The Special Initiative on Offshore Wind has been around since 2013, and it really is our goal to provide independent and strategic analysis and advice to state and federal policymakers in order to advance the responsible development of the offshore wind industry in the long term. And so typically we are looking kind of that next step out, not necessarily looking at projects that are under development now, but thinking about how the industry is going to fit into the larger picture, and whether that's environmental or technical or stakeholder related. So really appreciate the opportunity to represent the Special Initiative today, and thanks again for including me.
Absolutely, great to have you, Chris. Next up, we're also joined by Susanna Hatch, who is the Clean Energy Coalition Director with the Environmental League of Massachusetts, and she is also the regional lead of our New England for Offshore Wind Coalition, of which Environment America is a proud member.
Thanks, Hannah. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. As Hannah said, my name is Susanna Hatch, and I'm with the Environmental League of Massachusetts. I'm also the regional lead of New England for Offshore Wind, which is a regional coalition, and we're proud to sponsor Offshore Wind Day along with a few of our coalition partners, including, as Hannah mentioned, Environment America, National Wildlife Federation, and the League of Conservation Voters. So my work is focused on managing and supporting this New England for Offshore Wind Coalition, which is a growing regional coalition of over 80 organizations, including environmental advocacy organizations, academic and research institutions, justice and health organizations, business alliances, and labor unions. Coalition members hail from all 6 New England states and are working together to advocate for responsibly developed offshore wind in our region. Our key priorities as a coalition are to drive governors and legislatures to support regional collaboration and more offshore wind procurements to build the political will to power every home in New England with responsibly developed offshore wind by the mid-2030s. And we're also focused on making sure that those procurements, as Catherine was mentioning, align with our values of respect and responsibility, science-based decision-making, equity, and economic justice. So I'll leave it there. I'm glad to see so many people here interested in offshore wind, and I'm looking forward to participating in the discussion.
Wonderful. And last but not least, we're joined today by Representative Dylan Fernandes, who serves in the Massachusetts House of Representatives. Representative, take it away. Thank you.
Hi, thanks, Hannah. It's a pleasure to be here. I come at this issue from a couple different angles. As the representative of Barnstable, Dukes, and Nantucket counties, so 8 communities across 3 island communities south of Cape Cod. I represent more coastline than any other rep, certainly in Massachusetts, maybe the East Coast, and in a district that will be impacted more by the effects of climate change than any other. This is also a district where 12 miles south of the Vineyard, a few more miles, more than that, south of Nantucket, these first utility scale offshore wind projects are going. And so that's something that our communities have been largely very supportive of. And I also come at this issue as just a millennial legislator. There's no issue that'll impact my generation, my children's generation, more than that of the devastating effects that global warming will have, not just on our environment, but pretty much every aspect of our society. And so Massachusetts has been at the forefront of addressing this crisis, but we need to continue to lead. And offshore wind is our only path to 100% clean energy future. So looking forward to the conversation today. Thanks, Hannah.
Sure. Great. Well, it's so great to have all of you here on the call today. And I'd like to now transition to our discussion section of today's webinar. And I'd like to kick it off with this question, which is, what are some of the biggest benefits of getting offshore wind energy? And Chris, I'd like to direct this question to you first.
Well, how much time do you have, Hannah? No, I know we only have an hour together, so I will try to limit it. And I tried to make some bullets on this because I wanted to not stray too far. And I'm sure that my co-panelists will love to add on to this list. But I think, first and foremost, as the representative mentioned, it's the opportunity to mitigate potential, climate impacts. I think there is really no other technology that is at scale in the renewable space that works so well co-located in our coastal communities, especially on the Atlantic coast, as offshore wind is. There's no other marine renewables technology that's available at scale at this time. And so offshore wind really leads the pack in that way. Not only that, but the cost of offshore wind has come down precipitously over the past, 5-10 years or so. We see some great prices coming out of Vineyard and other developers on how they can deliver this power to us, not only in a cost-effective way, but in a way that really stimulates the economy while doing it. So it's something that, as we wait for the hopeful infrastructure package to pass out of Washington, D.C., something that can be a huge stimulus to the infrastructure that's badly needed in our ports and other related infrastructure. So it's exciting to think about offshore wind as an economic driver, not just for building the wind farms, but for all the infrastructure that's related and then supporting those wind farms. And then I'll just say, I think as you kind of stack up the alternatives to offshore wind, because, we are by attrition losing energy sources like coal-fired power plants, nuclear power plants, either through attrition or, kind of being phased out. And so when you think about the alternatives, the net environmental impact of an offshore wind farm that's properly sited, that's developed responsibly and done well, really on balance has some of the lowest impacts of generation sources and their alternatives. So those are just a couple of the benefits, in addition to really looking cool and being fun and futuristic. I'll stop there.
Great, thanks. And if other panelists want to jump in and say anything they think is some of the biggest benefits we could be getting from offshore wind energy, feel free to jump in.
I'd love to tack on to that, though. As Chris said, we could all talk for hours about this, so I'll try to be really brief. But just to add to the list, and to add to the picture of the economic benefits, I think that is such a huge piece, especially if we're looking at it from New England's perspective, where we're going to see a lot of this being built, you know, there's not just the local jobs side of things, which is huge, but there's also, you know, local economic benefits from the supply chain, and having local power means that we're not spending our money on sending. We're not sending our money outside of the region for energy as we are now. We spend tens of billions of dollars on natural gas and other fossil fuels right now to heat our homes and to power our economy. And so, you know, imagine having our energy source here and what that economic benefit will bring. And then, of course, you know, as we expand offshore wind, that also spells likely closures of power plants, which have a negative health impacts on environmental justice communities and other vulnerable communities. So the pollution reduction benefits will be pretty great as well.
Absolutely.
I want to add one thing that you know, there are so many of the bread and butter topics that we discuss here, but Chris hit on a critical piece that, in addition to the you know, climate change knocking on our door, this is a generational moment where power sources, the old guard power sources, are coming offline. I'm from Provincetown, and we go out to the beach and look across Cape Cod Bay and see Pilgrim Nuclear Power Plant, which was recently decommissioned and slated for the full wind down. As far as the infrastructure there in the coming years, was known to be one of the most dangerous and concerning nuclear facilities in the country. And then a little bit further to the south is Canal Power Plant, which when I was growing up, as a peaker plant, you'd see this brown line as emergency power in the hottest days in July or the coldest days in January. It would fire up and produce some of the dirtiest energy that we consume. We see offshore wind coming in to provide that item that's as close to base load power as you can get from a nuclear plant, and also comes on with reliability implications where it's got an extremely high productive level in those times when our energy sources are most constrained. So I'm sure Rep. Fernandes can speak about how this is shifting to become a post-partisan issue. You've got reliability, you've got, of course, the looming environmental justice concerns, and then you've got this economic development potential that Rep. Fernandes and others have sought to capture through policies in Massachusetts, and you see other states follow.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many benefits we can reap from developing renewable energy off our coasts. And that brings me to my next question, which, Susanna, I'm hoping you could touch on first, which is, can you just help us understand a little bit more about what the scope of potential for offshore wind is here in the US?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And I'll speak from the New England perspective, but of course, some of our panelists could also touch on this, the scale up and down the East Coast. But just to put this in perspective, New England in particular has enough technical potential of offshore wind to power our region 10 times over. So it's huge. There's enormous potential out there. And many analyses, you know, we're not going to build the full technical potential. That is a crazy amount of energy. But the analyses have shown that we are going to need a lot of offshore wind in order to get to net zero. Just as an example, the state of Massachusetts released their roadmap study to getting to net zero by 2050. They released it at the end of last year. And they found that New England as a region is going to need at least 30 gigawatts of offshore wind to reach net zero. Gigawatts, not everybody knows what that means. Just to put that in perspective, that's roughly the size of our current grid right now. So in order to decarbonize the economy, we're going to have to electrify more things, such as heating, such as vehicles. And so our electricity demand is going to grow. And offshore wind is likely to provide in New England 50% of the energy by 2050 if we're to meet net zero. So in short, it's massive.
And if any of our other panelists
Add
would like
on
to
briefly, you know, it's the end of March, last day of March. We all just experienced winter here. I love solar energy as much as everyone does, but anyone who just lived the last couple of months in Massachusetts knows we're not the sunniest state. And so while I'm in a house with solar panels on their roof, a lot of my neighbors have solar panels, and we need to continue to incentivize and encourage residential and commercial use of solar, but it just doesn't produce the same amount of energy that we get from offshore wind. It doesn't really even come close from a comparative advantage perspective. But we are one of the most windy states in the nation, and this area is one of the windiest places in America. And so we have a massive advantage here with offshore wind, and that's where we should be putting a lot of our resources. And in 2016, Massachusetts was the first legislature to pass legislation calling for utility scale offshore wind. That's something that I think residents of the state should be really proud of, because we led on that. And now you've seen procurements go up and down the East Coast calling for additional megawatts. And then you see the Biden administration this week, right? And so this is another example of Massachusetts leading the way on nation-leading policy, and then a lot of other states and the federal government catching up, so that Massachusetts really moves the needle for the rest of the nation by going first on this.
Absolutely. And something I think that Susanna touched on earlier, which I'd just like to reiterate, is that we are really going to need to electrify further as we move to decarbonize and transition to renewable energy. And we recently released a report at Environment America called Offshore Wind for America that examined the technical potential of offshore wind all across every coastal region. And what we found was that not only does every coastal region have offshore wind potential, but that even if we transition to run almost completely on electricity rather than fossil fuels by 2050, offshore wind could still provide 90% of that electricity. So just again, to put that in perspective, this is a really huge resource that we're working with, and not just for the East Coast, but also our Gulf states and our Pacific states, and even our Great Lakes states has something to offer. So it really is a resource for America. And on that note, I think we'll move on to our next question here, which I'll ask Nate to speak a little bit more on, which is, what's the current status of offshore wind here domestically? And could you touch a little bit on how Vineyard Wind ties into that and what our commitments look like and where we're going from here?
Sure, it's a great question. And I think we find that this answer to become antiquated on almost a daily basis. As we're still processing the Biden administration's announcement of Monday to try and hit 30 gigawatts by 2030. With our, I should say, meager amount of offshore wind currently in the U.S., which numbers in the double-digit megawatts. That's the Block Island project and the preliminary testing project for a project in Virginia. We think about attaining 30 gigawatts as a real challenge. And it was really interesting to hear Amanda Lefton, the head of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, point out that it's not actually as ambitious as it may even sound, because in the hopper currently, and again, these numbers become antiquated on a weekly or monthly basis. We've seen expanded procurements. We saw a climate bill passed by Massachusetts, which is going to boost Massachusetts procurements alone. We're looking at upwards of 30 gigawatts of commitments that have been made by the eastern states alone in recent years that are on the table. We're looking at, I think, somewhere just south of 10 gigawatts awarded, and some of those folks may have more up-to-date numbers, but we know New York just recently added 2.5 gigawatts. Again, back to this gigawatt megawatt thing for those people. My rule of thumb is that a megawatt can power 500 homes. A gigawatt can roughly power, therefore, about 500,000 homes. So we can, you try to use that as your math. Vineyard Wind's the first. The first has to happen. It's been 21 years since the U.S. Began this pursuit of offshore wind. Some would argue in a slipshod manner. Some would argue, the politicization of previous proposals, really derailed us. But it is something I think that all the folks on this call I would speak for we're cautiously optimistic that we're going to be aggressive about this. And when it comes to technology, we do have this, I would say almost perverse benefit of building on 20 or now almost a quarter century of European experience in building these machines. They're now, the engineering side, they're now predictable, understandable, reliable. And that means that there are very few mysteries in terms of the technical capability of these projects. It is merely fitting that into the matrix of the American model of government, of our energy grid, and those types of things. And Vineyard Wind, obviously, as well as other developers, is working through that, as are the advocates on this call here. It's been a rough road, of course, but one wouldn't expect it to be otherwise. And I think as we get to final on Vineyard Wind and Vineyard Wind 1 begins construction this coming fall, it will become real. And the administration, as well as states, signals have really begun to solidify the idea that we might have a stable scenario in which we can pursue this 30 gigawatts over the next decade and actually attain it.
Absolutely, and it's really cool to see Massachusetts making such great progress when we know that Massachusetts actually has the very highest offshore wind potential of any state in the US. So it's really cool to see us breaking ground there first. I think we'll now move on to our next question, which I'd love to have Catherine talk a little bit more about, which is just, can you talk about what are some of the challenges to offshore wind development?
Thank you. I won't use Chris's line, how much time do you have? But certainly this is a big topic. Maybe a better way to frame it, since I am a deep optimist, is this is sort of one of those where your greatest strength is your greatest weakness. In some ways, the greatest opportunities also do present the challenges. We've been talking about the scale, like the true scale of how much offshore wind energy is out there and how much of a huge role it can play in meeting our climate goals. And that means a lot of development off our coast in places where, we currently only have 7 turbines, in our waters here. Certainly there's thousands around the world, but it's new here. And there can just, there always will be a bit of a fear of the unknown until, as Nate says, we get, projects in the water and we're able to really have our communities and stakeholders really understand more about them and see what kind of impacts there may actually be. I think it's really sort of a moment where we're at where the promise of offshore wind really needs to meet the reality. We've had these states, as our representative said, Massachusetts went big and bold first with the first big state policy. Other states have followed, and so now we're at a place where we've got over 30,000 megawatts committed. And as of just this week, we have a federal government committed to delivering the leasing and permitting that we need to meet that level of development. And we've talked about the promise of that it can be developed responsibly. We can protect our coastal and marine wildlife while we do it. We will create all significant jobs and all of that. And now we're at the moment where the projects really are coming to life and need to really match that. And that it's not abstract anymore, right? And so that comes into thinking about stakeholders that have expressed a lot of opposition. One high profile, the commercial fishing industry has certainly, been at the table and expressing concerns. And, that's one of many, I think, sort of other users of the ocean that really need to be addressed. We need to figure out how to have these projects really in reality meet the promise. And so it's more of a general answer. I think it really comes down to right now seeing the environmental protections in place and seeing those economic benefits that we know this industry can deliver really come to life.
Yeah, and Hannah, if I could, I would like to add on to that. I think, generally, us in this group, we're supportive and we recognize the potential of offshore wind, to put it mildly. But I also think announcements like Monday from the administration, as much as I loved hearing it, doesn't necessarily send the best signal of bringing everyone along together. And that is something I think that, existing ocean users who have been using the space for generations are sensitive to and should be. And so when there's one policy about the ocean, whether it's energy, ocean, the space in the ocean or whatever it might be, I think that can be very threatening to existing ocean users. And so to have these platitudes and large goals where, others are not considered in a comprehensive plan, that could really be, could cause a slowdown in the industry overall, and something we need to be cautious about. I mean, I think just elaborating on Catherine's point, but yeah.
There's definitely a lot to think about when we think about actually developing offshore wind. And with that, I'd also like to transition to our next question, which is more about the policy side of things. And Representative Fernandes, I'd love if you could talk a little bit more about how can policymakers really drive our commitments to offshore wind, and maybe you could also delve a little bit into the legislation that you helped file in Massachusetts.
Sure. I mean, so from a national perspective, I think most people would tell you the best thing we can do to support offshore wind and renewables in general is to have a carbon tax of some sort, whether that's a flat carbon tax or a national cap and trade system. You know, we absolutely need that to further incentivize renewables. And a lot of the folks who do the development of these projects will tell you that, you know, it's a lot of these offshore wind projects, clean energy projects, just come down to issues of financing and market certainty, and market-based solutions have proven to be incredibly effective policies and end up at the end of the day producing the most net benefits for society. So on the national level, and even on the regional level through the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative across kind of the East Coast, you know, I think that could be strengthened, and nationally it'd be wonderful to have some policy like that. At the state level, you know, the governor just signed into law legislation that was led by the House and the Senate around expanding offshore wind up to 5,600 megawatts here in Massachusetts, and a net zero by 2050. And now we're filing new legislation to expand upon that. And Susanna has been incredibly helpful on that issue, on that effort, where we're expanding our offshore wind procurement. And we're saying that, you know, the administration, the governor, is allowed to go out and bid for additional procurements in the future to make the process a little more seamless. We had a requirement where I think we're the only state where each subsequent procurement has to be cheaper than the last. That made sense in the beginning when there was a big question about how affordable offshore wind would be. We've seen that it's incredibly affordable, and so kind of this cap issue can hamstring future projects and curb innovation. That's something we're looking to remove. And there's a lot of other components to this as well around funding for job and workforce training. We really, you know, in Massachusetts, you know, we led the nation on this. We're the windiest state, right? We want to make sure that we're the hub for this sector in the nation, and that we are getting both the clean energy benefits of this and the health benefits and the like that go along with that, but also capturing the lion's share of the economic growth that comes with that as well. So that's really what this bill is aimed at.
And we'd also like to acknowledge the leadership of Senator Julian Cyr, who leads the Senate on this legislation. And unfortunately, he couldn't be with us today, but his colleague Jeff Soares is in the audience with us today. And we do thank the senator for his advocacy for offshore wind.
I'd love to just pick up on that if I could, Hannah.
Sure.
Thank you if I'm muted. Okay. I think there's a really important point there about how big of a role the states really have to play in ensuring that offshore wind takes off as an industry, and that it does so in ways that can deliver the many benefits that, again, back to my concept of delivering the promise. And Representative had a good example of sort of how maybe a provision of the policy might have curbed that opportunity. And I think it's really exciting to see states really lean in through their procurement processes in adding provisions that would ensure that projects that they select are developed responsibly with strong protections for the environment and bring forth the many economic benefits and jobs to the state that our policymakers are looking to deliver. And I think that's a really that's a really exciting trend that we've seen in states along the coast, and one that I think will really help serve the industry well in ensuring that we have projects moving forward that really do meet the promise.
Great. Our next question on the agenda, Nate, I'm hoping you could speak to this a little bit more too, but could you tell us a little bit more about what the steps are actually involved in, getting offshore wind from an idea to actually getting steel in the water, as they say?
I think the theme for this whole meeting here should be how much time do you have? But we're doing a great job moving through this. I'll broadly go over some of the basics, but really focus on the things that might be most pertinent to the folks here. This all starts before the developer is involved, at least in this new phase of offshore wind with federal lease areas. So it's several years of state and federal collaboration and many hearings and a lot of technical review and input, including fisheries, endangered species advocates, communities, and others to identify those lease areas. The developer then steps in at the point where those lease areas are ready for auction and assembles a team with the technical and financial expertise to actually pursue the building of a wind farm. And then an auction occurs, leases are awarded. A whole massive range of technical and environmental science and data and feasibility and engineering work is done that is certainly jaw-dropping. Bids are precipitated by state policies largely, as Catherine and Representative Fernandes indicated, and then a developer basically presents the bid and then hopefully a winning proposal to supply energy to those states that seek it. And then the permitting and development phase kicks into a really high gear. It would have begun already into the stakeholder engagement at all levels and extensive conversations and input from those folks. When we get to the formal permitting process, that ramps into an even higher gear. This involves agreements with the towns, agreements with NGOs on various protections, and fisheries, of course, on accommodating shared use. Catherine brought them up. It's interesting and clear to see that from back 11 years ago, at least in looking at the Mass and Rhode Island wind lease areas, and I suspect others as well, how things have evolved in terms of the engineering plan, in terms of the way this has been pursued, in terms of protections that are going to be enshrined in the construction of these facilities. So that is, again, on the back of agreements and consultations with stakeholders. And that process moves through. There's dozens of permits needed at all levels of government. So really, kind of to step back, it starts with that legislative advocacy to push the policy forward, and then it really gets down into the sort of project and initiative level advocacy, which so many on this call are familiar with. The supplemental environmental impact statement that was precipitated by the previous administration and then kind of adjudicated, so to speak, this summer, saw a tremendous outpouring nationwide of support for a responsible pursuit of this industry, and that involved thousands of people. I would argue that the hundreds, and even some probably in the audience here and on this call, who spoke at those hearings to assert that this is the way that the U.S. and that Massachusetts should pursue these projects, had no more impact on climate change. That it was the biggest opportunity, and they really had a tremendous voice in crafting that policy and moving us forward, and are a big reason why we're here today. Because I think things, really felt like they were at a crossroads. So that stakeholder involvement at every level, and that advocacy involvement at every level, and it gets all the way down to the neighborhood level, is critical. These projects don't happen without that. And until the turbines are spinning for Vineyard Wind 1, about 18 to 24 months from now, I won't be satisfied that it succeeded. But we've done an amazing job, and the folks, it's been on the backs of advocates and folks who push those policies, and who see these projects and this movement, see it along through every step of the process. So there's a lot to be said there. The developer on our side, making the accommodations stepwise with stakeholders. I think about the endangered species work that we've done, and I also think about the accommodations for fisheries, developers coming together to realign and accommodate for the needs of fishermen for shared use. Technological advancements that in 2018, due to choosing a larger turbine, shrunk the footprint by about a quarter, and then more recently with this new 13 megawatt turbine that we're slated to use, will again shrink that footprint we're seeing less and less impact that accommodates for all stakeholders, and not just the developer, and not just the urgent needs for climate change and new energy sources.
And just to add on a little fun fact about those bigger turbines that Vineyard Wind is planning to use, we found out that they could actually power the average American home in just 7 seconds for a whole day. So these turbines are really incredibly powerful. And
one rotation.
Yeah, one rotation, exactly. So we know that the technology just continues to get better and better, and as it does, it becomes more efficient. And as Nate said, it does lessen that footprint, which is something we love to see. I'll move on to our next question before we'll open it up to the Q&A. I see a few questions coming in, but the question I'd like to finish this off with is, how does offshore wind fit into our existing energy system, and how can it be a complement to our other forms of renewable energy? Chris, do you want to take that one on?
Yeah, sure. And I'll lead off with something I've been thinking a lot about lately, and this idea of getting to, 100% clean energy targets, as many states or other policymakers are implying at this point. And I think about pairing offshore wind with solar and how they're so complementary to each other. True. The Northeast might not have a lot of sun, for sure, Representative. But when solar energy is being produced, that's, as you might imagine, during the middle of the day. Well, that tends to be the time when offshore wind is at its lowest and really has its peaks in, evening, morning, and late afternoon times. And so the complementary profile of offshore wind and solar is, really staggering. And I think really thinking more about pairing those two with some type of energy storage platform really could be the future of how we look at a renewable energy system, and not just one resource. It will take some creativity to figure out how to balance these load profiles as they are dynamic and intermittent. And so I don't think it's anything that we can't overcome with technology, but I still think it's, this really important, deliberate conversation that's happening. It's really important.
I'd love to amplify what Chris just said. All renewable energy is going to have to play a role. Offshore wind is going to play a big role, but everything is going to be needed. And that includes energy efficiency. If we're going to be really ramping up electrification, making sure that we are trying to maximize efficiency will be extremely important, so that we don't have to overbuild a transmission grid, and just to make sure that we're not using more energy than we need to. And of course, some of the new technologies are inherently more efficient. So heating your home with a heat pump that's electric is more efficient than other means. EVs are more efficient than gas-powered cars, but we're gonna need to focus a lot on that as well.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be a team effort of different renewable sources as we look towards a 100% renewable energy future. Wonderful. Well, that was a great discussion. I'd love to open it up now to some of our questions in the Q&A. I'd like to have this addressed by all our panelists, so feel free to jump in. But the first question I'd like us to address, this is a question from Elizabeth. Thank you for your question. She's wondering, do we need to make positive media attention about offshore wind in the US a priority? And how can you find out information about its benefits?
There are many places that you can find out about its benefits, but I will say one place is the website that we put together for Offshore Wind Day has a lot of good facts. New England for Offshore Wind also has a website with some great informational videos. It's newenglandforoffshorewind.org. And yeah, I mean, I think part of what we'd love to see is more conversation around offshore wind in the media. And that's talking about all of the things that we've been talking about, not just the promise of offshore wind and how important it's going to be to our transition, but also, what offshore wind looks like done right, to what Catherine has been speaking to. So I certainly agree that is something that should be a priority, so that we can all have a better understanding of what it looks like and what it could mean for our country.
And I think to add on to that, it's, my goal every day when I get up to tell one new person about offshore wind. That's when I wake up, I'm like, all right, who today is going to learn in the grocery store line or on a Zoom thing for my mom? Like someone's going to learn. And so offshore wind's kind of still a little bit like science fiction. And, to see the White House talking about offshore wind, every year during the State of the Union, I'm like, please let him say offshore wind, say the word, say it. It's not something our country as a whole is very familiar with. And so we in this bubble forget that. So I think just general education, and whether that's done through media or other resources, is really interesting. And letting people make their own, imagine this, letting people make their own opinion about it, getting the information out. And if some people, for example, intrinsically will never agree that offshore wind should be seen from a beach. That's a very subjective analysis. And who are we to say that that's true or not? But I think giving people the information of what they look like, how visible they are, for example, and just getting that information out there so people can make their own informed decisions, that's going to help move the holistic conversation forward in a way I think that's just more sustainable in the long term.
Yeah, what we've tried to define and really push as a trend in the industry as well is to have an extreme level of openness and accessibility when it comes to these developments. So it's never more than a click away. I mean, we've got dedicated pages on our website that have local information, which is not necessarily about these big issues we're talking about, but it's for neighbors saying when is that tractor to put the underground cable going to be in my neighborhood, and also just really the ability to have the developer on the phone via email, and that's both people with questions and interest and concerns, but also people that want to see ways that they can step into this process and positively influence it. We've got a lot of organizations here who have done a decade or more of work of getting these policies put in place, and now there's this transition which we're all engaging in to how do we actually finally, you can procure, or you can call for 1 billion megawatts, but until the resources are online, we don't have anything yet. And I think that's been a really amazing and interesting transition to see folks shifting to really trying to support projects themselves and get involved in the details of those projects. Each one will move through its process and can be derailed by any number of sort of the fervor of public concern or whatever, or even a small number of opponents. And so it's important that there's a lot of voices in there, and the groups on this call, and I'm sure many participating here have done good work in that. We need to continue to do it.
I think as well, talking to people about how offshore wind can positively impact their own lives is really important. There's a lot of us who just support offshore wind because, it's really our only chance at defeating and combating climate change. But for folks who aren't paying as much attention and just thinking about kind of their daily lives, making an effort to connect how offshore wind will positively impact them and their community, whether that's on the vineyard with the Vineyard Wind Project, bringing a staging area there that's going to bring 50 or so year-round good paying jobs to an island that is largely based on a seasonal economy. Like that's a huge boost that is tangible in people's lives and relatable. Talking about, as was mentioned earlier, the health benefits of transitioning to offshore wind from dirty energy. I mean, we're in the midst of a pandemic where people who had health and lung related respiratory issues were particularly vulnerable, and we've seen countless lives lost during this pandemic for people who have those respiratory issues. A lot of that is from the burning of fossil fuels. A lot of that is from the particulate matter released into the air by oil, gas, coal, and the like. Mostly coal, but the other two are bad as well. And so, this is, connecting with people about the health benefits that this will produce to them and their communities and keep them safer is also a great way to talk about offshore wind and transitioning to renewable energy generally.
That's a really good point. Just to maybe pick up on a number of things that the panelists had said. I think we're at such a great moment now where in the press and in our conversations with folks, Chris, I love that idea, where we can really be getting specific now again, right? It's not abstract anymore, as we're gonna see, you know, Nate's project and other projects moving forward. And so being able to not just talk about what might happen, but really focus on stories of what is happening and where to really kind of make this real for folks and help people understand what it really means for us.
I wanted to add one more thing that was reminded of is, you know, it's so clear that what the trade-off is here, and I think that's lost when we start getting into the weeds on these things. We've got the ability to pursue renewables in these forms, offshore wind, you know, community solar, those other items, or we can put dirty infrastructure undoubtedly near the communities that can already least afford it, and that is what we're dealing with. There is no other special thing floating around. And so it's so important to see that in the broader context, because you know, climate change issues are so big and looming, and we all think so much about them. We've got these, you know, it's a fossil fuel facility near a population that can't defend themselves, for lack of a better term, or it's these other pursuits. And thankfully, we're seeing not only the advocates here, but also governments now turning hard in a good direction.
Absolutely. You say no to wind, you're saying yes to something else.
Great. And I'd love to transition on to another question I'm seeing here in the Q&A, which is how can young people and concerned citizens help us get more energy from offshore wind?
I would say hold your elected officials accountable. One way to do it is not only to show up on election day, but to reach out to your state rep, your congressperson, no matter where you are in this country, and tell them about your feelings and your position on offshore wind. Let them know that this is an issue that you vote on, and organize your friends and family to do the same. And look, and then hold elected officials accountable. If elected officials are not supporting climate action, then they need to be voted out of office. We don't have enough time, right, to address this issue. We have a very short timeline for us to get to net zero by 2050, for us to hit our goals, you know, nationally under the Paris Agreement and statewide and regional goals. And so we need action now. And I would say getting involved politically is a good way to hold elected officials accountable for taking climate action.
Such a great point. And I would also just throw your governors in the mix there when you say, I'm sure that was what you meant as well. But in terms of the holding accountable, our legislators are doing such a great job here getting these policies in place. And then, you know, there is such an important role for these administrations up and down the coast to really follow through on the procurements and the permitting, that there is some role for our states on the permitting side as well. So really speaking up, I love the question, and it's really an important moment to ensure that everyone knows we're watching.
I would add, similarly, you know, participating in the regulatory process, you will never have a bigger megaphone than when you're one of a few hundred commenters at a regional or local or state or even federal process, where you can make your voice heard, speak to the merits and the questions about specific projects or regulatory changes. Those will be coming up, and folks, you know, the organizations will be keeping a keen eye on those, and that's a place where you can be, you know, beyond that legislative process, because as much as Rep. Fernandes says that the legislatures are doing their part, at least in our region, you want to keep the pressure there, but we're getting good results, and we can get hung up in other areas at the regulatory level that can derail this process after all the hard work's been done at the legislative level.
Absolutely. And if you're looking for a way to get involved today, my colleague Graham did drop the link to our Offshore Wind Day page here in the chat. And we have a link to a petition you can send to the Biden administration, as well as making use of our social media toolkits down there at the bottom. As Catherine said, it's super important to add our governors to this mix of folks that were asking for more offshore wind. So if you live on a coastal state, be sure to tag them and say we hope to see them going big on offshore wind. And we just have a couple more minutes here, so I'll just transition to one last question, which I'm seeing in the chat here, which is, could someone just speak to what are the ways that we can help mitigate the effects of offshore wind on our ocean wildlife and our marine ecosystems. I know we've touched on this a little bit already, but I think folks are looking to hear a little bit more about that.
Sure, I'm happy to kick that off. We absolutely, I take the question very seriously. It's something I think about every day here at National Wildlife Federation. We are so excited about the scale of offshore wind, but realize that, we're talking about building major energy infrastructure here in our ocean. We have very sensitive wildlife out there, critically endangered whales, birds, turtles, fish. There's, the ocean is full of our treasured wildlife. And so it really comes down to ensuring that we have really good science, that we are basing all of our decisions around where these projects go, how they're going to be developed, how they're going to be operated, on the best available science for how we can minimize those impacts, and that we're ensuring that decisions around projects, lease areas, and projects are done with strong stakeholder engagement. So we're getting all the best science and all the best input into these decisions. So that's just sort of in a broad brush. And then moving forward, we've got to be sure that we're monitoring and learning as we go. As we said, we've only got 7 turbines in the water here. We have much to learn from Europe, and there's certainly plenty to apply here, but we have unique species here and we have a unique context. And so we've got to get moving and then make sure that we are really collecting that good science that can continue to inform our decisions moving forward. So with that as the context, then it really does come down to finding the right locations and ensuring that the project development activities that occur there are done in ways that, based on the science and the stakeholder input, can really ensure that we're protecting those species. So it's complicated. I'm more optimistic than ever that it absolutely can be done. It just truly, I get asked this all the time, like, you say responsible development, what does it really mean? And who does it? Who's responsible? And it really takes a village. I mean, it takes developers. As it was saying, the industry really does need to lead here. It takes our policymakers. We need to put good, strong guardrails in place to ensure that we're protecting our resources. And it's on us as stakeholders to be bringing those key issues to the table and ensuring that they're receiving the attention that's needed.
Yeah, absolutely. Very important to be protecting our endangered species, especially. Well, we're just about at time. So I want to thank everyone so much for joining us today for Offshore Wind Day. With everyone again really quick, so you have the link to our Offshore Wind Day page, and you can also contact me at hreed@environmentamerica.com if you'd like to have any of your questions answered. I'm sorry we didn't get to everyone, but thank you so much for joining us, and happy Offshore Wind Day. Please take a visit to our page. You can find ways to take action there. Thank you.
Thanks for hosting, Hannah.
Thanks, Hannah.
Yeah, and a big thank you to our guest speakers. Thanks again for coming.
Thank you.